All right, ladies and gentlemen, after we've taken a spin to the eastern part of the world in China and Japan and Korea, we are heading back to Europe to talk about a couple of critical events that happened in the world of thought and science, and that is the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And that's going to be lesson 6a. And we're going to get started by taking a look at a preview of this particular lesson. So we're first going to talk about the scientific revolution, what happened and who some of the most important players were. Then we'll talk a little bit about the Enlightenment, which was kind of the scientific revolution for humankind. We'll look at absolute monarchs, and we'll add a term to that called the enlightened absolute monarchs. And then we will discuss a war that was almost one of the first world wars called the 7 Years' War, and it spilled out into North America and actually was a very important precursor to the American Revolution. We'll take a look at that as well. Your reading for this week is going to be the Scientific Revolution. It's chapter 17, pages 511 to 534. It's actually sections 1, 2, and 3 of chapter 17. As you're reading that, you're going to run into some key terms. They are geocentric, rationalism, scientific method, inductive reasoning, philosophe, and rococo. So those are some terms you're going to be looking for as you are reading today. All right, let's talk a little bit about the scientific revolution. Now, revolution, when we hear that word, I think we generally think about things like wars, the American Revolution, maybe the Islamic Revolution. There might be a number of different things we think about. But in reality, all a revolution means is a change. It's a modification, a different way of looking at things and a different way of reality. And that's really what the scientific revolution was. It was a change from a theological or God-centered, religion-centered worldview to secular, which is dealing with science and humankind. And it challenged older worldviews, views of the Greeks, the Romans, all the way up through some of the Renaissance thinkers. These were challenged based on new data, new information that was coming in based on the new science, essentially. Science itself was elevated to a new standing, to an important area of study that it had never had before. And we're looking at the world through observation and the scientific method. So what can we see? The reality is now defined to what we can see and what we can predict. And the first major thing that happens in the scientific revolution is that the universe, or at least our understanding of our place in the universe, changed. Copernicus, a scientist who existed in Europe during this time frame, essentially looked at the movement of objects in the sky, planets and stars, and recognized that the Earth itself was not the center of the known universe or the solar system. Truly, it was the sun, and that was called the heliocentric system. His data was confirmed and strengthened by Johannes Kepler, another scientist, who really did figure out exactly how the Earth travels around the sun. And then Galileo, who many of you have probably heard of, this is the guy that stood on top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa and tried to figure out gravity, or so the story goes, used controlled experiments and new technology, including things like the telescope, to understand the world a little bit better. Another scientist, a British scientist, Sir Isaac Newton, furthered this revolution by essentially coming up with one of the great works of scientific literature ever, and in 1687 completed his book called the Principia. And he essentially, in that book, took a look at how gravity, the concept of gravity, the force, essentially holds things together and can be used to understand the motion of objects, so that you can look and understand the force of gravity and figure out why planets travel around the sun, why moons travel around the planets, and why planets spin. He was unable to see many of these things that he predicted, but he used thought experiments. So he was able to use the math to figure out little experiments in his mind that he could understand based on the mathematics that he was looking at related to gravity. Another classic scientist who was really good at thought experiments was a little bit later, and that was Albert Einstein. The scientific method became critical. This is the idea that in order for us to understand our world, we have to have a process that we go through that can always come up with the same result, and that was called the scientific method. It's a procedure for collecting and analyzing information, and most of you have gone through in your science classes many experiments using the scientific method. It's based on inductive reasoning and gathering conclusions based on information that we observe. And it's critical that we follow it through all the time to make sure that the data that we receive is accurate. Now, the scientific revolution actually spawned a revolution of its own in thought related to humankind and humans' place in the universe and on the world. And thinkers essentially thought, the enlightened thinkers, looked at scientific method and said we should be able to do something like that to understand all aspects of life. And this new ideology was called rationalism. Many of the most wealthy and educated, and again at this point the average person is not being educated, they were the ones that thought in this, that were part of this particular Enlightenment thought. And it led to the rise in social sciences. So some of the things like history and philosophy and political science that we see today, we can thank the enlightened thinkers for that. What was the reaction to the scientific revolution? Well, not everybody believed in it. Not everybody thought it was a great idea to be focusing on science. And for the most part, the church especially found the Copernican idea of the Earth not the center of the universe is very concerning. This was something that they really questioned. The Catholic Church essentially tried Galileo when his ideas started to threaten some doctrine, and they required him to either recant or be excommunicated. And many authors used hypothetical stories to illustrate scientific ideas. Rather than coming out with actual statements that they could get in trouble with the church from, they came up with little stories that would also teach the same lessons and ideas. Now, during this time frame also, we still have these absolute monarchs. If you recall from a couple of lessons ago, the absolute monarchs were those kings and queens that ruled essentially by the grace of God through the divine right of kings and were unquestioned in their role. They're still on the throne for the most part, but they become now enlightened, which is the idea that they recognize their role in making life better for their constituents, for their people. Catherine the Great of Russia is a great example of a ruler like this, and really their desire was to bring sophistication and scientific thought to their nation, so trying to bring people up from where they had been before. At the end of this time frame, we now see a battle that occurs throughout Europe and actually spilling over into some of the colonies around the world called the 7 Years' War. And alliances in Europe and tensions over colonies around the world sparked this war. For the most part, it is a battle between the French and the British, but other nations are also involved. And we see battles as far-flung as places like Europe, India, and North America. In North America, the fighting between the French and the English really sets the stage for the American Revolution. It becomes the French and Indian War, which is one of the most important starting points for the American Revolution. So that's a little bit about scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. We'll talk more about this. You'll see more about this in your reading, and we'll talk again soon.